Hello, Browsworth, back with Trousered Apes, Sick Literature in a Sick Society by Duncan Williams. I believe we're on chapter 3, and save for the fact that I keep finding good books, I probably would have read this chapter a day or so ago, but with an upcoming book sale on Thursday, probably the biggest of the year, and a limited reading window thanks to changes in my work schedule. Probably be reading less this week, but we'll see. Chapter 3, The Genesis of the Anti-Hero. Can aught exult in its deformity? Shelley, Prometheus, Unbound. Hegel maintained that the whole history of man is an ever-continuing cycle of thesis and antithesis. We think we are progressing when in fact we are merely moving like a pendulum from one extreme to the other. The only two epics, is it epic? Let me check.
Epic.
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 Stupid. Epic. All right, it's epic. I thought it was, but I just wanted to make sure it's not epoch. Epoch Shakur. The only two epics when man achieved the state of synthesis would appear to be classical Greece and 18th century Europe, particularly England. In both, man saw himself as a being in harmony with the universe and with society, which he regarded as a microcosm of that universe. If we regard Aristotle's Poetics and Ethics and Pope's essay on criticism and essay on man as establishing aesthetic and ethical theories for their respective ages, then this statement would appear to be broadly true. In both periods, society as a whole consciously aimed at attaining perfection, not only in architecture, music, poetry, and other art forms, but also in the moral sphere. Thomas Aquinas saw the universe as a general sacrament, as a principle of the idea which the artist tries to reproduce, supreme end of all that was, is, and will be, sovereign rule of all that we should do. And one feels that the Greek classicist and the Augustan, never mind my candle, that's a good look. Woo! It's actually a very good look, bruv. Take it in. Neoclassicists would both subscribe to this view. Such epics of synthesis, however, appear to carry the seeds of self-destruction within them, and beneath the apparently placid calm of the 18th century, forces were at work in the last 2 decades, which were to tear down most of the remaining walls of classical restraint. Broadly speaking, the revolution took place in 3 major fields: politics, religion, and literature. Politically, the French Revolution brought to an end the ancien regime, I don't know which one it is, and caused Burke, in a well-known passage from his reflections on the revolution in France, to lament that the age of chivalry is gone, that of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever. He wasn't wrong. In religion, the preachings of John Wesley helped undermine the authority of the established Church of England. In the literary world, a movement, the roots of which extended far back into the century, and which was certainly not confined to any one country, came into full maturity. For want of a better name, I shall call this last Romanticism, although as Professors Lovejoy and C.S. Lewis have shown, this term has been so overused that it has been rendered almost meaningless. These three seemingly unconnected revolutions on closer inspection reveal that compact unity of their epic, characterized by a rejection of authority and by an emotional appeal. The anti authoritarian nature of the French Revolution is too apparent to need any comment. Wesley rejected the classical formalism of the church, and his followers felt the need to establish themselves as a separate body. Romanticism was largely a powerful reaction to the restraint and moderation of neoclassicism. James Joyce makes the distinction between these two concepts very effectively when he describes the classical temper as displaying security and satisfaction and patience, and the romantic temper as being insecure, unsatisfied, impatient. Is that really? I mean, he's basically like a Satanist, just going against Christianity in those terms. The statement that these three revolutionary movements were dependent upon an emotional appeal may need a fuller explanation. The writers and philosophers who prepared the ground for the French Revolution, men such as Voltaire, Diderot, and to a certain extent Rousseau, based their arguments against injustice on reason. Yet, when these ideas were translated into action, the dominant mood was emotional. Liberty, equality, and fraternity is a slogan designed to appeal to men's hearts rather than to their rational faculties, and as power passed more and more from the moderates to the extremists, and finally to the mob, the shift was complete. A mob never has been and never will be swayed by any other than an emotional appeal. And it took a Napoleon to reintroduce into France even the vestiges of discipline and control. In terms of religion, Wesley, appalled by what he considered the indolence of the established church and the indifference of the aristocracy to the sufferings of the poor, preached the gospel of salvation through personal conversion. Confining himself largely to the proletariat, his sermons induced in his audiences what the British historian G.M. Trevelyan has styled convulsions, agonies, and raptures. Whether Wesley intended it or not, the response of congregations with limited theological knowledge had to be emotional. Wesley himself records that during his addresses, 85 of his listeners dropped as dead. A number became temporarily insane, and 9 succumbed to incurable madness. Maybe Wesley himself was the problem in that case, buddy. In literature, this same trend is abundantly demonstrated. The two predominant characteristics of the Romantic movement are a belief in the holiness of the imagination and a corresponding rejection of reason. The negation of energy, and therefore the source of all evil to Blake, is the reasoning power in man. His aim is to cast off rational demonstration by faith in the Savior, to cast off the rotten rags of memory by inspiration, to cast off Bacon, Locke, and Newton from Albion's covering, to take off his filthy garments and clothe him with imagination, to cast aside from poetry all that is not inspiration. This same impatience with restraint and search for an emotional outlet for the imagination can be seen in Wordsworth's definition of poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Though Wordsworth, the most cautious of all the Romantic poets, does later add that such powerful feelings are recollected in tranquility. It can be seen in Keats's remarks in a letter to Benjamin Bailey, "I am certain of nothing but of the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of the imagination. I have never yet been able to perceive how anything can be known for truth by consecutive reasoning. Oh, for a life of sensations rather than of thoughts." It can also be seen in the dark nightmarish symbolism of the Ancient Mariner and of Christabel and in the various Gothic novels of the period, it may be summed up as a complete rejection of the classical golden mean. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom, wrote Blake, and as such it has a great deal in common with contemporary literature and thought. Soren Kierkegaard, the acknowledged source of much that has subsequently been formulated under the title of existentialism, echoes the essential mood of romanticism when he states that the conclusions of passion are the only reliable ones. There is a clearly identifiable link between the movements which culminated in the political, religious, and literary revolutions at the end of the 18th century and their present counterparts. The twin forces which characterize these revolutions, anti-authoritarianism and emotionalism, have increased in strength and influence and are the progenitors of the violent and animalism which dominates today's avant-garde literature and thought. It may be objected that the political revolution occurred in France, the religious one in England, the literary one in at least 3 countries, but all are manifestations of the European zeitgeist of the time, which, springing from the same psychic sources, subsequently interacted one upon the other. Blake was kindly disposed towards Methodism and sang the praises of the French Revolution, as did Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, and Byron. Generally speaking, they all saw Satan, the non plus ultra of anti-authoritarianism, as the real hero of Paradise Lost. Shelley greatly admired William Godwin's political justice, which in theory at least advocated the abolition of the monarchy, the class system, property ownership, marriage, and almost everything else. Much of the third act of Prometheus Unbound is simply Godwin versified. Of major importance is the fact that all 3 manifestations had a profound impact upon the political, religious, and literary life of America, where they reinforced the anti-authoritarianism which, as de Tocqueville pointed out, was already part of the national character. Significantly, it is in America that so much of the modern avant-garde movement has evolved or has been avidly and uncritically accepted. Footnote 1. If one examines the names of those who directed literary trends between 1900 and 1960, it would appear that France, I don't know how to say that name, Anule, Camus, Genet, Gide, Ionesco, Proust, Sartre, Valery, and America, Albee, Eliot, Faulkner, Ginsberg, Hemingway, Miller, Pound, Williams, preponderate with Ireland, Beckett, Joyce, Shaw, Yeats, runner-up. The list, which admits such powerful influences as Brecht, Kafka, and Lawrence, to say nothing of the continuing impact of the psychological theories of Freud and Jung, is obviously incomplete, but it does, nevertheless, reveal something about the sources of modernism. Moreover, and somewhat ironically, the emergence of America in the past few generations as the political and cultural leader of the West has resulted in what one might term the re-export of such anti-authoritarianism. Consider the example of countless Hollywood films shown around the world in which the well-spoken, cultivated individual is depicted as the villain, whereas the hero displays a mannerless, graceless, ape-like exterior beneath which the audience is induced to believe there lurks a heart of gold. Pardon! It is interesting to speculate upon the possible state of contemporary Western society had America been founded upon Hobbesian as opposed to Lockean concepts of human nature. Yeah, it sure would, buddy. I don't really know Thomas Hobbes, but Locke was no fucking anti-authority. I guess he was anti-authoritarianism to the extent that authority usurp the rights of the individual. This glorification of the primitive is simply an extension of the 18th century concept of the noble savage, an essential feature of Romanticism, which Spengler saw as yet another symptom of the decline of culture, of a culture. The soul thinks once again, and in Romanticism looks back piteously to its childhood. Then finally, weary, reluctant, cold, it loses its desire to be and wishes itself out of the overlong daylight and back in the darkness of proto-mysticism, in the womb of the mother in the grave. There is a startling and alarming similarity between this statement and that of Fiedler, in which he sees a weariness in the West, a weariness with the striving to be men. It is tempting, in view of my thesis, to see in the French Revolution and Romanticism the catastrophic events which Burke and Spengler do to view the 18th century as the gleaming autumn of our culture. But this would involve an oversimplification. The 18th century was, after all, an age of contrast, civilized, polished, and urbane at the top, brutish, ignorant, downtrodden, and in the English cities, gin-sodden at the bottom. What distinguished the first half of the century from subsequent ages, however, was the profound belief among the majority of the cultivated that by exercising his powers of reasoning and self-control, man could perfect himself. This belief is reflected in the literature of the period, which tends to be moralistic and which manifests an avowed didacticism, qualities hardly likely to appeal to modern readers. Ephraim. This obvious moralistic and didactic tendency appears to have originated in the Hegelian swing of the pendulum away from the bodiness and air religion of the Restoration period. Thus, in 1698, the reformer Jeremy Collier, in a short view of the immorality and profaneness of the English stage, declared that the business of plays is to recommend virtue and discountenance vice, to make folly and falsehood contemptible, and to bring everything that is ill under infamy and neglect. A few years later, Joseph Addison stated in The Spectator, "For my own part, I have endeavored to make nothing ridiculous, that is, not in some measure criminal. I have set up the immoral man as the object of derision, a sentiment echoed by Johnson, who defined a writer's duty as being to make the world better. The novel, having been until recently essentially a popular literary form, is a useful social reflector, and if we examine the works of the most popular novelist of the period, Samuel Richardson, several significant insights may be obtained. His first novel, Pamela, 1740, has the revealing subtitle, Virtue Rewarded, and tells of a servant girl's successful attempts to escape rape at the hands of her master. I don't know if I should have said that word. It will probably get me a strike, but so successful is she that he eventually marries her. What? And in the last two of the 4 volumes, he is depicted as having become, under her influence, an ideal husband. It is fashionable nowadays to dismiss this book contemptuously as an example of its author's prudential morality. One modern critic has described it as a procrastinated rape, but this clearly was not the message which it had for its contemporary readers. On the title page of the original edition, Richardson stated that he was publishing it in order to cultivate the principles of virtue and religion in the minds of the youth of both sexes, and Alexander Pope declared that it would do more good than many volumes of sermons. Although it may strike a modern reader as exhaustingly long and tedious, it enjoyed a fantastic popularity among its contemporaries. Fans, waxworks, plays, and even an opera were constructed on the Pamela theme, Imitations and parodies poured forth, and there is no doubt of its extensive influence on the sensibility of the age. The villagers of Slough in Buckinghamshire, for example, who were unable to read, gathered in the village smithy of an evening while the smith read the story to them. When he came to the chapter in which Pamela finally marries her master, the villagers, in their enthusiasm, swarmed out to the nearby parish church and rang the bells in honor of the wedding. One cannot suppress the suspicion that their modern, urban counterparts would be more inclined to such a demonstration were she to be. Richardson's second novel, Clarissa, is even longer than Pamela, and for this reason is now largely neglected, although it is one of the most powerful and effective pieces of writing in our language. The heroine, Clarissa, having run away from home to escape an odious marriage arranged by her parents, is ravished by her protector, aptly named Lovelace, and eventually dies, neglected and abandoned. Her seducer is finally killed in a duel by Clarissa's cousin. The didactic nature of the theme is reinforced by the author's preface, in which he states that the aim of the book is to warn children against preferring a man of pleasure to a man of probity. Having displayed his male characters in a more or less unfavorable role, Richardson obviously felt when he came to write his last novel, Sir Charles Grandison, that he needed to depict a hero, a man of elevated sentiments and bearing. In Richardson's words, Grandison exemplifies a man acting uniformly well through a variety of trying scenes, because all his actions are regulated by one steady principle. A man of religion and virtue, of liveliness and spirit, accomplished and agreeable, happy in himself and a blessing to others. This depiction reflects its age much as the Declaration of Independence reflects American thought in the 1770s. The whole idea of neoclassicism is summed up in the words accomplished and agreeable, happy in himself. And if the reader should reject all this as mawkish naivety and assert that Richardson's morality is simply thinly disguised prurience, then possibly he is merely manifesting his own temporal provincialism. It may be thought that I have devoted too much attention to a largely neglected 18th century novelist. What the hell's on my hand? But Richardson's Grandison is an extremely significant literary figure. He reappears in modified form throughout 18th and 19th century fiction and is the archetypal hero of the English novel. He survived the onslaught of Gothic novels, the self-torturings and introverted agonies of young Werthers, and the posturings of the Byronic heroes to reappear in the pages of Thackeray, Trollope, and a host of other semi-forgotten Victorians. Today, he has no living descendant. His place has been taken by the anti-hero, unaccomplished, disagreeable, unhappy in himself, or by the victim, a helpless creature at the mercy of blind, implacable forces, Jimmy Porter, the protagonist of Osborne's play. His anti-hero and victim rolled into one. It may appear as to us unsophisticated and naive that Richardson and his readers should take it for granted that a worthwhile idea is represented by a man accomplished and agreeable, happy in himself and a blessing to others, but it is not symptomatic of a far healthier culture than the nervous, introspective, and often self-destructive characters typified in contemporary fiction. The didacticism and moral purport of the 18th century writers were not confined to the novel. From the Romantic period on, critics have been justifiably infuriated by some of the tamperings with Shakespeare, which began at the end of the 17th century and continued throughout the 18th. Foremost among these, certainly the one which has drawn upon itself most contempt and obloquy, is Nahum Tate's version of King Lear, which was first produced in March 1681. It is interesting and significant that this version, which had a happy ending, Lear being restored to his kingdom and Cordelia marrying Edgar, was performed to the exclusion of Shakespeare's Lear throughout the entire 18th century and well into the 19th. The reason for the rejection of Shakespeare's play was that it failed, in Collier's words, to recommend virtue and discountenance vice. Johnson is once again very revealing when he censors Shakespeare for sacrificing virtue to convenience and adds that he is so much more careful to please than to instruct, that he seems to write without any moral purpose, italics, italics mine. I gotta stop here. I'm at 25 minutes and I've got, 4 pages? Don't think I can finish them, but I'll try. Nor was this view confined to literary critics. The philosopher David Hume, in his Essay of Tragedy, 1757, is unequivocal on the subject. The mere suffering of plaintive virtue under the triumphant tyranny and oppression of vice forms a disagreeable spectacle and is certainly avoided by all masters of the drama. We may tend to assume that didacticism is absent from modern literature. The very word has a fusty, old-fashioned flavor, repugnant to our sophisticated taste. But when a philosopher such as Sartre deserts the lecture hall and writes plays designed to be produced throughout the Western world, it can only be because he wishes to disseminate his views, to put across his ideas to a far wider audience than is possible in the comparatively narrow confines of a university. This is merely another form of didactic literature. There can be little doubt that Sartre's aim, whether he would admit it or not, is to influence people into adopting an existential viewpoint. As T.S. Eliot observed, the author of a work of imagination is trying to affect us wholly as human beings, whether he knows it or not, and we are affected by it as human beings, whether we intend to be or not. This is true of all writers, regardless of whether their aims be Marxist, moralist, relativists, or even nihilistic. And we forget this as readers or theater goers at our peril. The only real difference between Richardson's didacticism and that of contemporary writers is that the former's is explicit and therefore less insidious. Furthermore, our contempt for the moralistic tampering with Shakespeare is yet another instance of our being unable to see the mote in our own eye. Anyone who has attended a recent performance of Shakespeare in London or Stratford-upon-Avon may, on reflection, realize that such productions are equally revealing of our age as were those of the 18th century. Today's representations emphasize, predictably, the violent and animalistic aspects in Shakespeare. Footnote: one could cite many examples, but the following will be sufficient to illustrate my point. In the 1963 Stratford production of The Tempest, which shocked even some hardened drama critics, Caliban was portrayed as almost completely animal. More blatant was the execution on a gallows on stage of the rebels, Worcester and Vernon, in the 1964 production of Henry IV, Part 1, also at Stratford. This directly violates the stage directions Exeunt, Worcester, and Vernon guarded. On the screen, the trend is predictably the same. Playboy magazine heralded the recent Zeffirelli production of Romeo and Juliet as beautiful. The entire film is a poem of youth, love, and violence, a Renaissance recapitulation of West Side Story, played with pure, sick 1968 passion, italics mine. Meanwhile, Richard Burton, who was apparently considering producing a new film version of Macbeth, was quoted as saying, "The script has been rewritten to give it a little Bonnie and Clyde flavor." In other words, all literature, including the production of plays, appears to reflect the fashions and mores of its time, and there are more ways than one of distorting an author's original intentions. As we have already seen, Romanticism rejected most of the ideas of the neoclassicism, substituting liberty and emotionalism for restraint and decorum. But if one examines carefully the writings of the major English poets of the period, one can see that the revolt was still incomplete. Nature still provided Wordsworth with the same kind of assurance that it had given Pope. It induced in the former that blessed mood in which the burthen of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened, until eventually the poet states that with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. And I'm going to stop there because I have no way of possibly finishing the last 3 pages in 3 minutes, so I will stop there. As apparently the limit is 33 minutes on my camera for no known reason, even though I can record about 2 or 3 hours worth of material, but for whatever reason it stops at 33. So I will too at 30. Goodbye, bruv. Goodbye.